In the summer of 1998, a small town in rural Oregon became the center of a mystery that would haunt investigators for more than 2 decades. A young woman vanished without a trace, her car found abandoned on a quiet forest road, keys still in the ignition. The police launched what appeared to be a thorough investigation, interviewing witnesses, combing through evidence, and assuring the grieving family that every lead was being followed. But recently uncovered documents tell a very different story. Files that were never meant to see the light of day reveal something far more disturbing than simple investigative mistakes. What they show is a pattern of deliberate choices, evidence that was set aside, leads that were ignored, and questions that were never asked. And the reason why might be more shocking than the disappearance itself. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was 23 years old when she disappeared on July 14, 1998. She worked as a waitress at a family diner in the town of Clearwater, Oregon, population just under 4,000. Everyone knew Sarah. She was the kind of person who remembered your coffee order, who asked about your kids, who left little notes of encouragement on receipts for customers who seemed down. Her mother, Linda Mitchell, described her as a dreamer who wanted to become a nurse someday, someone who believed in helping people. Sarah lived in a small apartment above the town's only bookstore, drove a pale blue Honda Civic, and had never been in any kind of trouble. She was ordinary in the best possible way. But on that July evening, ordinary turned into unthinkable. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah was at 6:45 p.m. when she finished her shift at the diner. A coworker, Jessica Drummond, later told police that Sarah seemed distracted that day, checking her watch more than usual. When Jessica asked if everything was okay, Sarah smiled and said she had somewhere to be, but didn't elaborate. She clocked out, waved goodbye, and walked to her car in the small parking lot behind the building. That was the last time anyone who cared about her saw Sarah Mitchell alive. 3 hours later, a local hunter driving home from checking his traps spotted Sarah's Honda on Timber Ridge Road, a winding 2-lane highway that cut through dense forest about 12 miles outside of town. The car was parked at an odd angle, half on the shoulder, half on the road. The driver's side door was open, and Sarah was nowhere to be found. The hunter, a man named Dale Pritchard, immediately called the police from a payphone at a nearby gas station. Deputies arrived within 20 minutes and began searching the immediate area with flashlights, calling Sarah's name into the darkness. They found her purse on the front seat, wallet intact with $43 inside. Her cell phone was there too, an old flip phone with a dying battery. The keys dangled from the ignition and the car was still running, tank nearly full. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood. It was as if Sarah had simply stepped out of the car and vanished into the forest. But here's what didn't make sense. Sarah had no reason to be on Timber Ridge Road. It wasn't on her route home from work. It didn't lead to any place she was known to frequent. And according to Jessica, Sarah had mentioned having somewhere to be, which suggested a plan, a destination. So what was she doing 12 miles outside of town on a road that led essentially nowhere? By morning, the entire town knew Sarah was missing. Volunteers organized search parties, combing through the forest on both sides of Timber Ridge Road. The local sheriff, a man named Robert Hendricks, held a press conference assuring everyone that his department was doing everything possible. He described Sarah as a beloved member of the community and urged anyone with information to come forward. Linda Mitchell stood beside him, her face pale and drawn, clutching a photo of her daughter. She made a tearful plea for Sarah's safe return, her voice breaking as she said, "Sarah, if you can hear this, please come home. We love you. We just want you home." The searches continued for 5 days. Trained dogs were brought in. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew over the forest. Divers checked nearby creeks and ponds. But they found nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a single trace of Sarah Mitchell. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole. In the first week of the investigation, Sheriff Hendricks publicly stated that there was no evidence of foul play. He suggested that Sarah might have gotten disoriented in the forest, perhaps injured herself, or suffered from some kind of medical episode. But the people who knew Sarah found that hard to believe. She was healthy, familiar with the outdoors, and not someone prone to reckless behavior. More importantly, Why would she have driven to that specific location in the first place? Linda Mitchell began asking questions that the police seemed reluctant to answer. She wanted to know if they'd checked Sarah's phone records. She wanted to know if they'd interviewed everyone who'd seen her that day. She wanted to know why her daughter's car was on that road. Sheriff Hendricks assured her that the investigation was ongoing, but as weeks turned into months, it became clear that the case was growing cold. And then after 6 months, the searches stopped completely. The volunteers went home, the media moved on to other stories. And Sarah Mitchell became another unsolved disappearance, a ghost story whispered in a small town that wanted desperately to forget. For 23 years, Linda Mitchell refused to give up. She kept Sarah's case alive however she could, posting on early internet forums, connecting with families of other missing persons, and filing Freedom of Information requests for police documents. Most of her requests were denied or heavily redacted, but she kept trying. She spent thousands of dollars on private investigators who turned up nothing new. She attended every town council meeting demanding that the police reopen Sarah's case. Most people treated her with pity, some with annoyance, but Linda didn't care what they thought. She was a mother looking for her daughter, and she would never stop. In interviews years later, Linda would say that the worst part wasn't just losing Sarah. It was the feeling that no one was really trying to find her. That the investigation had been, in her words, going through the motions from day one. She couldn't prove it, but she felt it in her bones. Something was wrong with how the police had handled her daughter's case. And in the spring of 2021, she would finally be proven right. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former Clearwater County Sheriff's deputy, named Marcus Webb, had retired in 2019 after 30 years of service. Webb had been one of the deputies who responded to Sarah's abandoned car that night in 1998, and the case had stayed with him. According to his own account, he'd always felt that something wasn't right about how the investigation was handled. But he'd been a junior deputy at the time, low on the department hierarchy, and when he'd raised concerns to his superiors, he'd been told to keep his mouth shut and follow orders. Now, years later, and no longer bound by departmental loyalty, Webb decided it was time to tell the truth. He reached out to Linda Mitchell through a mutual acquaintance and told her he had information about Sarah's case, information that had never been made public. When they met at a coffee shop in a neighboring town, Webb brought with him something Linda had been seeking for over 2 decades, copies of the original case file, including documents that had been deliberately excluded from official reports. What Marcus Webb revealed that day would change everything. According to the files he'd secretly copied before retiring, there were multiple pieces of evidence that had been documented but never properly investigated. The first was a set of tire tracks found near Sarah's car, clearly from a second vehicle. The tracks indicated that another car had been parked behind Sarah's Honda, close enough that it would have blocked her in. The tracks were photographed and measured, but they were never cast in plaster, never analyzed, and never mentioned in any public statement. In Webb's notes from that night, he'd written, "Second vehicle definitely present. Tracks suggest deliberate positioning. Recommend immediate follow-up." But there had been no follow-up. The tire track photos were filed away and forgotten. When Webb had asked Sheriff Hendricks about it days later, he was told the tracks were probably from the hunter who discovered the car. Except Dale Pritchard, the hunter, had parked his truck 50 yards up the road, not behind Sarah's vehicle. His tire tracks were also documented, and they were completely different. The second piece of ignored evidence was even more troubling. Sarah's cell phone, found on the passenger seat, had been logged into evidence but never properly examined. In 1998, cell phone forensics weren't as advanced as they are today, but basic information like call logs and stored numbers were easily accessible. According to the evidence log, the phone had been checked into the property room, but there was no record of anyone examining its contents. Marcus Webb remembered specifically suggesting that they pull the phone records to see who Sarah had been in contact with before she disappeared. He'd even filled out the request form for the phone company, but Sheriff Hendricks had told him it wasn't necessary, that they already had enough information. Webb had been confused by this response but didn't push back. He was young, inexperienced, and had been taught to trust his superiors. It wasn't until years later, after working dozens of other cases, that Webb realized how abnormal that decision had been. In any missing person investigation, especially one involving a vehicle abandoned in suspicious circumstances, phone records were among the first things you pulled. Always. No exceptions. So why had Sheriff Hendricks blocked that basic investigative step? The third piece of evidence was perhaps the most damning. On the morning after Sarah's disappearance, a teenage boy named Kyle Morrison had walked into the sheriff's office with his mother to report something he'd seen the night before. Kyle had been out riding his bike on Old Mill Road, which intersected with Timber Ridge Road about a quarter-mile from where Sarah's car was found. At approximately 7:15 p.m., just 30 minutes after Sarah left work, Kyle saw a pale blue Honda followed closely by a dark-colored pickup truck heading toward Timber Ridge. He remembered it because the truck seemed to be tailgating the smaller car aggressively, and he'd thought they might be racing or arguing. Kyle's statement was taken by a deputy and filed in the case folder. But according to Webb's documents, Kyle was never interviewed again. His testimony was never pursued. No effort was made to identify the pickup truck or its driver. In the official case summary, Kyle Morrison's statement wasn't even mentioned. It had been buried, deliberately excluded from the narrative that Sheriff Hendricks was building. That Sarah had driven to that location alone, for unknown personal reasons, and disappeared into the forest. When Linda Mitchell read through these documents in that coffee shop, she began to cry, not just from grief but from rage. For 23 years, she'd been told that the police had done everything they could, that there simply wasn't enough evidence to go on. That sometimes people just disappear and there are no answers, but these files proved that wasn't true. There had been evidence, there had been leads. There had been a clear indication that Sarah hadn't been alone on that road, that she'd been followed, possibly forced off the road by another vehicle. And all of it had been ignored, set aside, buried. Linda looked at Marcus Webb across the table and asked the question that would drive the next phase of this investigation. Why? Why would they do this? Webb's answer was careful, measured. He said he didn't know for certain, but he had suspicions. And those suspicions pointed to a name that had come up during the original investigation, a name that had been carefully protected. A name that Sheriff Robert Hendricks had been determined to keep out of the case file no matter what. Before revealing that name, it's important to understand the dynamics of Clearwater, Oregon in 1998. With a population under 4,000, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where family names carried weight, and where certain people held disproportionate power. The town's economy depended primarily on logging and a small lumber mill owned by the Carver family, who'd been in the area for 4 generations. Douglas Carver, the mill's owner, employed nearly a quarter of the town's workforce. He sat on the town council. He funded the local high school football team. His donations had paid for the new wing of the community hospital. In many ways, Douglas Carver was Clearwater. Crossing him meant risking your job, your reputation, your place in the community. And Douglas Carver had a son named Ethan, who in 1998 was 28 years old, unemployed, and had a growing reputation for drinking, bar fights, and harassment. Especially harassment of young women. Multiple complaints had been filed against Ethan Carver over the years, but none had ever resulted in charges. Sheriff Hendricks had always found reasons not to pursue them. The victims were mistaken. The incidents were misunderstandings. Boys will be boys. That was the phrase people heard over and over. Boys will be boys. According to Marcus Webb, Ethan Carver's name came up within hours of Sarah's disappearance. Another waitress at the diner, a woman named Rachel Torres, had told deputies that Ethan had been coming into the restaurant regularly for weeks, always asking to sit in Sarah's section. Rachel said Sarah had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around him, that he'd asked her out multiple times and she'd politely declined, but he kept persisting. On 2 occasions, Sarah had found notes left on her car windshield, handwritten messages that started sweet but became increasingly possessive. I know we're meant to be together. Why are you ignoring what we have? You can't avoid me forever. Sarah had shown these notes to Rachel and Jessica, and they'd urged her to report them to the police. But Sarah had been hesitant. She knew who Ethan's father was. She knew how things worked in Clearwater. She didn't want to cause trouble that might cost her her job or make her life more difficult. So she kept quiet, hoping Ethan would eventually lose interest. Rachel Torres reported all of this to deputies on the second day of the investigation. She even provided one of the notes that Sarah had given her for safekeeping. It was logged into evidence. And then, according to Webb, Sheriff Hendricks personally removed it from the active case file. Marcus Webb's suspicions went deeper. He revealed to Linda that on the third day of the investigation, he'd been assigned to interview Ethan Carver as part of routine questioning of people who knew Sarah. Webb and another deputy, a man named Tom Griffith, drove to the Carver property, a large house on 20 acres outside of town. When they arrived, Douglas Carver answered the door and immediately became hostile. He demanded to know why they were harassing his son. He threatened to call the mayor, the county commissioner, and anyone else who might make their lives difficult. But Webb and Griffith insisted, and eventually Ethan came to the door. Webb described him as visibly nervous, sweating despite the cool morning, avoiding eye contact. When asked about his relationship with Sarah Mitchell, Ethan claimed he barely knew her, that he'd eaten at the diner a few times but had never spoken to her beyond placing his order. When confronted with Rachel's statement about his repeated visits and advances, Ethan became defensive, then angry. He said Rachel was lying, that women in this town were always trying to cause problems for him because of his family's money. Webb then asked Ethan where he'd been on the evening of July 14th. Ethan said he'd been home all night, and his father confirmed it. That should have been just the beginning of the questioning, but it wasn't. Before Webb and Griffith could dig deeper, Sheriff Hendricks radioed them and ordered them back to the station immediately. When Webb and Griffith returned, Sheriff Hendricks was waiting in his office with Douglas Carver. What happened next, Webb later described as one of the most disturbing moments of his career. The sheriff told Webb and Griffith that they'd overstepped their authority, that interviewing Ethan Carver without clearing it first was unacceptable, and that if they ever pulled something like that again, they'd be looking for new jobs. Douglas Carver sat in the corner, arms crossed, a slight smile on his face. Webb tried to argue that they were just following standard investigative procedure, that Ethan had a documented history with Sarah and needed to be properly questioned. Hendricks cut him off. He said the Carver family was not involved in Sarah's disappearance, that pursuing that angle was a waste of resources, and that he didn't want to hear another word about it. Deputy Griffith, who'd been with the department longer, told Webb later to drop it. He said that's how things worked in Clearwater, and if Webb wanted to keep his job, he'd learn to pick his battles. Webb, young and idealistic, didn't want to accept that, but he also had a wife and a mortgage, so he stayed quiet, and he'd regretted it for 23 years. After meeting with Marcus Webb, Linda Mitchell knew she had to act. She took the documents to the Oregon State Police and demanded that Sarah's case be reopened. Initially, she was met with bureaucratic resistance. The case was old, the evidence compromised by time, and there was no guarantee that a new investigation would yield results. But Linda was persistent, and Webb's testimony, along with the documented evidence of investigative misconduct, was compelling. Finally, in August of 2021, the Oregon State Police announced that they were reopening the investigation into Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. The case was assigned to Detective Samantha Chen, a veteran investigator with a reputation for meticulous work and not being afraid of powerful people. Chen assembled a small team and began reviewing everything from scratch, including the evidence that had been ignored in the original investigation. She tracked down witnesses from 1998, many of whom had never been properly interviewed. She obtained phone records that should have been pulled 23 years earlier. And she focused intensely on Ethan Carver, who was now 51 years old and still living in Clearwater, still protected by his family's name. But that protection was about to run out. Detective Chen's first major breakthrough came from Sarah's phone records, which the state police finally obtained from archived telecommunications data. The records showed that on July 14, 1998, Sarah had received 7 calls from the same number between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. The calls had started shortly after her lunch shift and continued throughout the afternoon. The final call came at 6:32 p.m., just minutes before she left work. Each call lasted less than a minute, suggesting that Sarah wasn't answering or was hanging up quickly. When Detective Chen traced the number, it came back to a landline registered to Douglas Carver's lumber mill. Further investigation revealed that the calls had been made from a phone in the mill's break room, which employees had access to during their shifts. But according to employment records, Ethan Carver had been on the mill's payroll in 1998, listed as a supervisor despite rarely showing up for work. It was a nepotism job, a way for his father to give him income and legitimacy. Ethan had access to that phone. And the timing of those calls, the persistence, the final call right before Sarah disappeared, painted a picture of harassment escalating into something far more sinister. Chen's team also tracked down Kyle Morrison, the teenager who'd witnessed Sarah's car being followed by a dark pickup truck. Kyle was now 40 years old, living in Seattle, working as a software engineer. He remembered that night vividly and was surprised to learn that his statement had never been properly followed up on. When Chen showed him photos of various vehicles from 1998, Kyle immediately identified a dark green Dodge Ram as matching the truck he'd seen. Then Chen showed him a photo of Ethan Carver from that time period. Kyle studied it for a long moment, then said the man looked familiar, that he might have seen him driving around town, but he couldn't be certain after so many years. However, vehicle registration records from 1998 showed that Ethan Carver owned a dark green 1996 Dodge Ram. The vehicle had been registered in his name until 2000, when it was reported as sold, though no buyer information was filed. Detective Chen put out a request to locate the vehicle, hoping that even after 2 decades, it might turn up somewhere, and incredibly it did. A farmer in eastern Oregon had bought the truck from a salvage auction in 2001 and had been using it on his property ever since. Chen and her team drove 6 hours to examine it. The truck was in rough condition, weathered by years of farm use, but it was intact. Detective Chen's forensic team spent 2 days going over every inch of that vehicle. They pulled samples from the truck bed, the cabin, the tires. Most of the biological evidence had degraded beyond use, but the forensic team focused on the truck's undercarriage and wheel wells, where dirt and debris from 1998 might still be trapped. They carefully collected soil samples, plant material, and other particulates. Back at the lab, those samples were compared to soil and vegetation from Timber Ridge Road, specifically from the area where Sarah's car had been found. The results were striking. Mineral composition, pollen content, and specific plant species found in the truck's wheel wells matched the Timber Ridge location. More specifically, they matched a pull-off area about 100 yards past where Sarah's car had been abandoned, a spot hidden from the main road by dense trees. It was the kind of place someone might drag a body if they wanted to hide it quickly. The soil evidence placed Ethan Carver's truck at that exact location during the same time frame as Sarah's disappearance. It wasn't absolute proof, but it was a connection that Sheriff Hendricks had worked hard to prevent anyone from making. Armed with this new evidence, Detective Chen obtained a warrant to search the Carver property. It was a bold move that sent shockwaves through Clearwater. Douglas Carver was still a powerful figure, though he'd handed over day-to-day operations of the mill to others and was now in his 80s. Ethan still lived in a guest house on the family property, his life having amounted to very little despite his father's wealth. The search took place over 3 days in November 2021. Police cadaver dogs were brought in, ground-penetrating radar was used to scan the extensive grounds, and investigators combed through buildings, vehicles, and storage areas. They didn't find Sarah's remains, but they found something almost as damning: a metal storage locker in the garage of Ethan's guest house containing items that clearly didn't belong to him. There were pieces of women's jewelry, photographs of young women who appeared to be unaware they were being photographed, and a small notebook filled with handwritten entries. The entries were disturbing, obsessive ramblings about various women Ethan had fixated on over the years. And there, dated throughout June and July of 1998, were multiple entries about Sarah. Saw her again today, she smiled at me, she knows. Left her a note, she has to understand how I feel. She's playing hard to get. She wants me to chase her. And then, dated July 15th, the day after Sarah disappeared, a final entry that made Detective Chen's blood run cold. It's done. She'll never ignore me again. With this evidence, the Oregon State Police arrested Ethan Carver on November 18, 2021, and charged him with the kidnapping and murder of Sarah Mitchell. The arrest made national news. A 23-year-old cold case, a powerful family, allegations of police corruption and cover-up. It had all the elements that captivate public attention. But for Linda Mitchell, watching the arrest on television, the dominant emotion wasn't triumph. It was grief mixed with fury. Grief for the daughter she'd lost, fury that it had taken more than 2 decades to get justice simply because one family had been too powerful, one sheriff too corrupt. In an interview the day after the arrest, Linda said, I knew from the beginning something was wrong. They didn't want to find her. They wanted to protect him. She was right. Documents that emerged during the discovery phase of Ethan's trial would reveal the extent of Sheriff Hendricks's corruption. Bank records showed regular cash deposits from Douglas Carver to Hendricks over a span of 15 years. Hendricks had also received a loan to purchase a vacation property that had never been repaid. The relationship was clear. Hendricks protected the Carver family, and the Carver family ensured Hendricks lived comfortably. Sarah Mitchell had been sacrificed to maintain that arrangement. Ethan Carver's trial began in September 2022. The prosecution's case was circumstantial but compelling. The phone records showing repeated contact, the witness testimony about harassment, the soil evidence linking his truck to the location, and most powerfully, his own written confession of sorts in that notebook. The defense argued that the notebook entries were just the ramblings of a lonely, troubled man, that "it's done" could mean anything, and that there was no direct physical evidence connecting Ethan to Sarah's actual death. They emphasized that Sarah's body had never been found, that no one had witnessed a crime, and that the prosecution couldn't even definitively prove that Sarah was dead. It was a weak defense, and the jury saw through it. After 3 weeks of testimony and just 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Ethan Carver showed no emotion as the verdict was read. In the gallery, Linda Mitchell collapsed into the arms of the friend sitting beside her, sobbing not with joy but with exhausted relief. It was over. After 24 years, there was finally accountability. Ethan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even as justice was served, enormous questions remained unanswered. The most important one, where was Sarah? In the months following the conviction, Detective Chen continued working the case. Her focus shifted entirely to recovery. Linda Mitchell deserved to bring her daughter home, to give Sarah a proper burial. Chen revisited every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every map of the area around Timber Ridge Road. She studied Ethan's patterns, his family's property, places he was known to frequent. She interviewed him multiple times in prison, hoping he might finally tell the truth, but Ethan remained silent, smirking through every session. Douglas Carver died in January 2023, taking whatever knowledge he might have had to his grave. The Carver property was sold, the lumber mill closed, and the family name that had once dominated Clearwater became synonymous with corruption and murder. But still, no one knew where Sarah Mitchell's remains were. It seemed that secret might stay buried forever. Until a hiker made an extraordinary discovery in the summer of 2023, 25 years after Sarah disappeared, and what he found would finally bring Sarah home. On July 20th, 2023, a man named Trevor Huang was hiking an old logging road deep in the forest about 8 miles from where Sarah's car had been found. The road had been abandoned for decades, barely passable, used occasionally by hunters and adventurous hikers. Trevor was photographing wildlife when his dog began acting strangely, pawing at the ground near a collapsed section of what appeared to be an old earthen berm. Trevor went to investigate and noticed what looked like fabric partially exposed in the eroded soil. He pulled at it gently and realized it was clothing, badly deteriorated but unmistakably human. Trevor immediately called 911. Within hours, the area was swarming with police, forensic teams, and investigators. They carefully excavated the site over the next 2 days. What they uncovered was a shallow grave containing skeletal remains, fragments of clothing, and a few personal items that had survived decomposition. Dental records and DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew. They'd found Sarah Mitchell. She'd been there all along, hidden in a location so remote that it might never have been discovered if not for erosion and a dog's keen sense. After 25 years, Sarah was coming home. The discovery of Sarah's remains brought some measure of closure, but it also raised new questions. The grave site was miles from both Timber Ridge Road and the Carver property. How had Ethan transported Sarah's body there? Had he done it alone? Detective Chen's team analyzed the location carefully. The old logging road was accessible by vehicle if you knew it was there, but it required navigating through unmarked trails and had likely been even more overgrown in 1998. Someone unfamiliar with the area would never have found it, but the Carver family had owned timber rights to large sections of that forest. Douglas Carver's lumber operation had used those old logging roads for decades. Ethan had grown up exploring those woods, hunting with his father, learning every hidden path and forgotten trail. He'd known exactly where to go, exactly where to hide a body where it might never be found. Forensic pathologists examined Sarah's remains and found evidence of blunt force trauma to her skull, confirming that she'd been murdered. The scenario that emerged was this. Ethan had followed Sarah that night, possibly called her from a payphone and convinced her to pull over or forced her off the road. He'd killed her, likely in a rage when she rejected him one final time. Then he'd driven her body to this remote location, buried her quickly, and returned home, where his father provided him an alibi and Sheriff Hendricks made sure no one looked too closely. Sarah Mitchell was laid to rest on August 15, 2023, in Clearwater's Hillside Cemetery. Hundreds of people attended, far more than the town's current population, as former residents returned to pay their respects. It was both a funeral and a reckoning. Linda Mitchell, now 71 years old, delivered a eulogy that was equal parts loving tribute and fierce indictment. She spoke about Sarah's kindness, her dreams of becoming a nurse, the light she'd brought to everyone around her. Then she spoke about the 25 years stolen from both of them, the decades of searching and grief, and the corruption that had allowed a murderer to walk free while a mother suffered. "My daughter deserved better," Linda said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "She deserved a police force that cared more about truth than money. She deserved a community that valued her life as much as it valued keeping powerful people comfortable. She deserved justice, and it took 25 years because people chose to look the other way." The crowd was silent. Many were crying, because Linda's words weren't just about Sarah. They were about every time someone in Clearwater had known something was wrong and said nothing, every time someone had chosen comfort over courage, and they all knew she was right. The fallout from Sarah's case extended far beyond Ethan Carver's conviction. The Oregon Attorney General launched an investigation into the original handling of the case, and in March 2024, a damning report was released detailing systemic corruption in the Clearwater County Sheriff's Office during Robert Hendricks's tenure. Hendricks himself had died in 2015, escaping legal accountability, but the report recommended that his pension be revoked posthumously and that his family repay certain benefits. Multiple other cases from that era were flagged for review, as it became clear that Sarah wasn't the only victim whose justice had been obstructed. At least 3 other unsolved disappearances and assaults from the late 90s had connections to Ethan Carver or other members of prominent families, and in each case, investigations had been mysteriously curtailed. Detective Chen was assigned to review all of them. The culture of corruption in Clearwater had protected predators for decades, and now, finally, there was a chance to make things right. But for the families of those other victims, the revelation that their loved ones' cases had been sabotaged brought a grief similar to Linda's. The agonizing knowledge that justice had been possible all along, if only someone in power had cared enough to pursue it. Marcus Webb, the retired deputy whose conscience had finally broken the case open, was hailed as a hero by some and a traitor by others. In interviews, Webb rejected both labels. He said he'd simply done what he should have done 23 years earlier, and the fact that it had taken so long was a failure, not an achievement. "I was young and scared," he told a reporter. I was afraid of losing my job, of being pushed out, of becoming an outcast in a town where I'd lived my whole life. So I stayed quiet. And because I stayed quiet, Sarah stayed in that grave for 25 years. Webb's honesty about his own complicity was refreshing in an era where people rarely accept responsibility for their mistakes. He acknowledged that fear was understandable but not an excuse. That institutions depend on individuals having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Webb moved away from Clearwater after the trial, saying the town held too many painful memories. But before he left, he visited Sarah's grave and left a handwritten note that Linda Mitchell later shared publicly. It said, "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder. I'm sorry I let fear win. Your mother never gave up and she's the hero in this story, not me. Rest in peace, Sarah. You're finally home." For Linda Mitchell, the end of the legal proceedings didn't bring the closure people expected. She'd spent 25 years fighting for answers, and now that she had them, there was an emptiness that nothing could fill. "People think closure means peace," she said in a 2024 interview. But it doesn't. It just means the questions stop. The grief doesn't stop. The missing doesn't stop. Linda established the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping families of missing persons navigate investigations, particularly when they suspect corruption or incompetence. She lobbied for stronger oversight of law enforcement, for independent review boards, for mandatory transparency in missing person cases. Her advocacy work gave her purpose, a way to channel her loss into something that might prevent other families from suffering as she had. But late at night, Linda admitted, when the work was done and the house was quiet, she was still just a mother who missed her daughter, who wondered what Sarah's life would have been like if she'd become a nurse as she'd dreamed, who she might have married, whether Linda would have had grandchildren. All the futures that Ethan Carver had stolen with his selfishness and violence, and that Sheriff Hendricks had helped him escape for 2.5 decades. The case also sparked a broader conversation about small-town corruption and the way power protects itself. Clearwater wasn't unique. Across America, there are communities where certain families hold disproportionate influence, where law enforcement is more focused on maintaining order and protecting local elites than pursuing justice. Sarah Mitchell's story became a touchstone for discussions about accountability, about the need for external oversight when local institutions become corrupted. Journalists investigated similar cases in other small towns and found disturbing patterns, disappearances that were ruled accidents too quickly, investigations that stalled when they pointed toward powerful suspects, families who were told to stop asking questions. The problem was systemic, woven into the fabric of how many rural communities operated. The solution wasn't simple. It required cultural change, legal reform, and most importantly, individuals willing to speak up even when it cost them something. Marcus Webb had eventually found that courage, but how many others remained silent? How many other Sarah Mitchells were still hidden in shallow graves because someone chose loyalty to power over loyalty to truth? Those were the questions that haunted everyone who learned this story. One of the most poignant aspects of Sarah's case was the role of ordinary citizens in finally achieving justice. It wasn't the police, at least not initially, who solved this case. It was a mother who refused to give up, a retired deputy who eventually chose conscience over comfort, witnesses who held onto their memories for decades, and a random hiker whose dog found what professional searches had missed. This pattern repeats in many cold cases. The breakthrough comes not from dramatic forensic revelations or police heroics, but from persistent people who care enough to keep looking, keep asking, keep refusing to let a case be forgotten. In the years since Sarah's case was solved, several other families in Oregon have successfully pushed for their own cold cases to be reopened. They've used Linda Mitchell's playbook: freedom of information requests, media attention, public pressure, and refusal to accept bureaucratic dismissals. Some have achieved justice. Others are still fighting, but all of them were inspired by a waitress from Clearwater and her mother who wouldn't let the world forget her. That perhaps is Sarah Mitchell's real legacy, proof that determination can overcome even entrenched corruption if you're willing to fight long enough. Detective Samantha Chen continues to work cold cases for the Oregon State Police. In interviews, she speaks about Sarah's case as a turning point in her career, not because of its complexity, but because of what it revealed about institutional failure. "We like to think the system works," Chen said. "We like to believe that police investigate fairly, that evidence is followed wherever it leads, that justice is blind." But Sarah's case shows that's not always true. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes it's designed to fail, to protect certain people at the expense of others. Chen has become an advocate for reform within law enforcement, pushing for better training, independent oversight, and consequences for officers who obstruct justice. She's met resistance, as reformers always do, but she's persistent. She says she owes that much to Sarah, to Linda, and to all the victims whose cases were buried by corruption. "I can't bring Sarah back," Chen said, "but I can make damn sure that what happened to her doesn't happen to someone else. That's the job now." That's the mission. It's a mission that requires changing not just policies but cultures, not just systems but people. And it's a mission that will take generations. But it starts with cases like Sarah's, with truth-telling and accountability, and refusal to let injustice be swept away quietly. Ethan Carver remains in prison, and by all accounts, he's exactly where he belongs. He's never shown remorse, never admitted his guilt beyond the verdict that convicted him, never told investigators details that only he knows. Fellow inmates report that he spends most of his time alone, that he's not well liked even by prison standards, that there's a particular contempt reserved for men who hurt women. Good. In a strange way, Ethan's life sentence is perhaps more just than a death penalty would have been. He exists in a cage, forgotten by almost everyone, his family's power and money meaningless behind those walls. Every day is the same, monotonous, joyless, purposeless. The complete opposite of what Sarah's life might have been. She had dreams, potential, the possibility of growth and love and achievement. Ethan took all of that from her. And now he has nothing but time to sit with what he's done, though people who know him doubt he's capable of real reflection. Some people are just broken in ways that can't be fixed. Ethan Carver appears to be one of them. The best society can do with such people is separate them from those they might harm. At least in that, finally, justice has been served. The town of Clearwater itself has struggled with its identity in the aftermath of Sarah's case. For decades, it had defined itself by its timber heritage, its close-knit community, its small-town values. But Sarah's case revealed that those values had been hollow, that the community had protected a predator and punished a victim. Many younger residents have left, seeking opportunities elsewhere and wanting to escape the town's tainted reputation. The lumber mill is closed, the Carver mansion sits empty and deteriorating, and Clearwater's population has dwindled to fewer than 3,000. Some businesses have shuttered, unable to survive the economic decline and the stigma attached to the town's name. Yet there are people working to rebuild Clearwater into something better. A new generation of leadership has taken over the town council and the county sheriff's office. They've implemented transparency measures, community oversight, and training programs focused on bias and accountability. They've erected a memorial to Sarah in the town park, a simple stone bench with her name and dates, and the inscription, "May we always remember. May we always do better." It's a small gesture, but it's something. An acknowledgement that the town failed her and a promise, however tentative, to be different going forward. One of the questions people often ask about Sarah's case is whether there were other victims. Given Ethan's pattern of obsessive behavior and the evidence of other women he'd fixated on, it seems unlikely that Sarah was his only target. Detective Chen investigated several other unsolved cases from the 90s and early 2000s, looking for connections to Ethan Carver. She found circumstantial links to at least 2 other disappearances: a college student who vanished in 1996 after reporting a stalker, and a bartender who went missing in 2002 under similar circumstances to Sarah. Both cases had been investigated minimally and closed without resolution. Both victims had reported unwanted attention from men they couldn't quite identify. And both had last been seen in areas where the Carver family had business or property connections. Chen believes Ethan was responsible for these disappearances as well, but without concrete evidence or confession, proving it is nearly impossible. Ethan has been interviewed multiple times about these other cases. Each time he smirks and says nothing, exercising his right to remain silent. It's a final act of cruelty, denying other families the closure that Linda Mitchell finally achieved. Those cases remain open, their victims still missing, their families still waiting. And Ethan holds the answers but chooses to take them to his grave. It's evil in its purest form. The legal accountability didn't stop with Ethan Carver. In 2024, Linda Mitchell filed a civil lawsuit against Clearwater County and the estate of Robert Hendricks, seeking damages for wrongful death and investigative misconduct. The lawsuit detailed how Hendricks's corruption had directly prevented Sarah's case from being solved, prolonging Linda's suffering for 25 years. It named specific instances of evidence suppression, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. The county fought the lawsuit initially, but public pressure and mounting evidence made their position untenable. In August 2024, they settled for $8.5 million, one of the largest civil rights settlements in Oregon history. Linda donated the majority of the settlement to the Sarah Mitchell Foundation and to other organizations supporting families of missing persons. She kept enough to live on comfortably but said the money felt tainted, that no amount could compensate for what she'd lost. "You can't put a price on 25 years, she said. "You can't buy back the time I spent searching instead of grieving, fighting instead of healing. The money will help other families, and that gives it meaning. But it doesn't give me my daughter back." The settlement also included a formal apology from Clearwater County, an admission that its law enforcement had failed Sarah Mitchell and her family. It was the first time any official body had said those words. Better late than never, perhaps, but only barely. For investigators and forensic specialists, Sarah's case has become a teaching tool. It's used in training programs to illustrate how corruption destroys investigations, how evidence must be followed regardless of where it leads, and how institutional pressure can compromise individual integrity. Police academies, forensic science programs, and criminal justice courses all reference the Sarah Mitchell case when discussing ethics and accountability. What makes it particularly valuable as a teaching case is that the failure wasn't technical. The investigators in 1998 had the tools and knowledge to solve Sarah's disappearance. They had witnesses, they had evidence, they had a clear suspect. What they lacked was the moral courage to pursue justice when it threatened powerful interests. That's a lesson you can't teach with forensic techniques or investigative procedures. It requires examining your own values, deciding what kind of person you want to be, what kind of profession you want law enforcement to be. Every student who learns about Sarah Mitchell has to confront the question, would you have done what Marcus Webb eventually did? Or would you have stayed quiet, protected your career, and let a murderer go free? It's an uncomfortable question, but it's the most important one. Technology played an interesting role in solving Sarah's case, but not in the way you might expect. This wasn't a case solved by advanced DNA techniques or digital forensics, though those tools helped confirm evidence. The case was broken by old-fashioned documentation, paper files that Marcus Webb had quietly copied, knowing they might be destroyed. In an era where everything is digital, there's something poignant about paper evidence being the key, but technology did help in other ways. Linda Mitchell's use of early internet forums to connect with other families of missing persons created a support network that sustained her through decades of searching. Later, social media allowed her to keep Sarah's case in the public eye, to share updates and rally support. When the case was finally reopened in 2021, online true crime communities amplified it, creating pressure that helped ensure thorough investigation. The double-edged nature of this attention is worth noting. True crime has become entertainment, and there's something troubling about people treating real tragedies as consuming content. But in Sarah's case, that attention translated into accountability. Thousands of people followed the investigation, attended the trial, and celebrated the verdict. They became a form of crowdsourced oversight, making it harder for the case to be buried again. Technology gave Linda an army of strangers who cared about Sarah, and that made all the difference. As the years pass and Sarah's case recedes from the headlines, what remains is the human story at its core. A young woman who worked hard, dreamed of helping people, and was killed for rejecting someone who felt entitled to her attention. A mother who refused to accept that her daughter would be forgotten, who fought bureaucracy and corruption for a quarter-century because love demanded it. A deputy who eventually chose conscience over career, even when it came decades too late. A detective who took a cold case personally and gave it everything she had. And a community that had to confront its own complicity in enabling evil. These are the elements of Sarah's story, and they reflect something universal about human nature, our capacity for both terrible failure and extraordinary persistence. We fail in moments of fear and self-interest. We succeed through stubbornness and love. Sarah Mitchell's life was stolen by the former, but her story was finally told because of the latter. In that telling, there's a hope that feels fragile but real. That truth matters, that justice can prevail, that ordinary people have more power than they realize. You just have to be willing to use it, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. The emotional toll on everyone involved in Sarah's case is impossible to quantify. Linda Mitchell has spoken openly about her struggles with depression and PTSD during the decades of searching. The constant uncertainty, the bureaucratic obstacles, the feeling that she was screaming into a void while everyone else moved on. It took a severe psychological toll. She attended therapy sporadically, but she said nothing really helped except the search itself. Looking for her gave me purpose, Linda explained. If I stopped, if I accepted that she was gone and I'd never know what happened, I don't think I could have survived that. So I kept looking, even when it hurt, because searching for her meant she was still with me in some way. That kind of prolonged grief. What psychologists call ambiguous loss is uniquely devastating. It's loss without closure, mourning without an ending. Even now, with Sarah found and buried and her killer in prison, Linda says some part of her is still searching. It's become such a fundamental part of her identity that she doesn't know how to stop. The foundation helps. Supporting other families gives her a way to channel that energy. But she admits the wound will never fully heal. Some losses are simply too great, some injustices too profound. You don't recover from them. You just learn to carry them, one day at a time, until it's your turn to rest. Marcus Webb also struggled deeply with his role in the case, both the original failure and the eventual revelation. In interviews, he's been candid about the guilt he carried for 23 years, knowing he'd had evidence that could have led to Sarah, but had stayed silent because he was afraid. You tell yourself you made the right choice, Webb said. You tell yourself that speaking up wouldn't have changed anything, that Hendricks would have buried the evidence anyway, that you would have just lost your job for nothing. You tell yourself these things until you almost believe them, but then you wake up at 3 in the morning and you know the truth. You were a coward. And someone stayed in a grave because of it. Webb's decision to finally come forward was liberating but also devastating. He'd ended the silence, but he couldn't undo the years of loss. He'd given Linda Mitchell answers, but he couldn't give her back her daughter. In some ways, Webb said, he'd sentenced himself to a different kind of prison. Not physical bars, but the permanent knowledge of his own moral failure. He hopes that by speaking publicly about it, by letting himself be judged and criticized, he might prevent other young officers from making the same choice. If his shame can teach someone else to be braver, he said, then maybe it means something. Maybe it's a small form of redemption, but it will never be enough. Detective Samantha Chen has spoken less about the emotional impact, but colleagues say the case changed her. She became more driven, more meticulous, less willing to accept official narratives without scrutiny. The knowledge that an entire police department had conspired to protect a murderer shattered some fundamental assumption she'd had about law enforcement. She'd believed that most cops were good, that the system generally worked, that corruption was the exception. Sarah's case forced her to confront the possibility that corruption might be more common than she'd wanted to believe. That good cops staying silent might be just as damaging as bad cops acting maliciously. Chen has become something of an outsider in law enforcement circles as a result of her advocacy for reform. Some colleagues respect her. Others resent her for making them uncomfortable, for asking questions about practices they'd rather not examine. But Chen seems unbothered by the politics. She says the work is what matters, The victims are what matter, and if she has to be unpopular to do the job right, so be it. She visits Sarah's grave occasionally, usually alone, usually at the end of a difficult case. She says it reminds her why she does this work, why it matters to be thorough and honest and unwilling to accept easy answers. Sarah Mitchell deserved better than she got. And Chen has made it her mission to ensure that every case she touches is handled with the care that Sarah's should have received from the beginning. In the end, Sarah Mitchell's story is about more than one murder or one corrupt sheriff. It's about the thousands of unsolved disappearances across America, the families still waiting for answers, and the systemic failures that make justice so difficult to achieve. It's about the way power protects itself and the courage required to challenge it. It's about a mother's love that refused to be quieted or forgotten. It's about moral choices that seem small in the moment but echo for decades. Every year in the United States, approximately 600,000 people are reported missing. Most are found quickly. But thousands remain unaccounted for, their families trapped in the same nightmare Linda Mitchell endured. And in some of those cases, the obstacle isn't lack of evidence or witnesses. It's lack of will. It's institutions more committed to protecting themselves than serving justice. Sarah's case proved that even decades later, even against entrenched corruption, truth can emerge. But it shouldn't take 25 years. It shouldn't require a mother to sacrifice the rest of her life to the search. It shouldn't depend on one guilty deputy finally finding his conscience. The system should work the first time, every time, for everyone. That's the dream. That's what we owe to Sarah and all the others still waiting to be found. Sarah Mitchell would have been 48 years old today. If she'd lived, she might have become the nurse she dreamed of being. She might have married, had children, grown old, surrounded by people who loved her. We'll never know what she could have been, what contributions she might have made, what joy she might have experienced and shared. That future was stolen on a summer evening in 1998 by a violent man who couldn't accept rejection, and it was buried for 25 years by a corrupt system that valued power over truth. But Sarah's legacy lives on in the foundation that bears her name, in the reforms her case inspired, in the families who found courage in Linda's example, and in every investigator who remembers her story and chooses to do better. She lives on in truth told and justice served, however late. Her story reminds us that there is no statute of limitations on truth, no amount of power that can permanently bury it, no corruption so deep that persistence cannot overcome it. It reminds us that every victim deserves to be fought for, that families deserve answers, and that justice delayed is still worth pursuing. Sarah Mitchell was found because people refused to let her be forgotten. And that refusal, that stubborn insistence that her life mattered, is the most powerful legacy any of us could hope to leave behind. If you or someone you know has information about a missing person case, please come forward. Your testimony might be the piece that brings someone home. Your courage might be the catalyst that finally breaks a case open. Don't let fear silence you. Don't let power intimidate you. The Sarah Mitchell case proves that it's never too late to do the right thing, and that one person speaking up can change everything. For more information about supporting families of missing persons, visit the Sarah Mitchell Foundation online. And remember, every missing person is someone's daughter, someone's son, someone's everything. They all deserve to be found. They all deserve justice. And they're all counting on us to care enough to make it happen. This has been the story of Sarah Mitchell, a young woman whose life was stolen but whose memory sparked change. Her case is closed now, her killer behind bars, her remains finally at rest beside those who loved her. But somewhere out there, another family is searching. Another case is being ignored. Another truth is buried by those who should be uncovering it. The fight for justice never really ends. It just moves to the next case, the next family, the next person who refuses to accept that some victims don't matter. That's where we turn our attention next, to another disappearance that defied explanation, another investigation that failed its victim, and another truth that took decades to emerge. Because these stories need to be told, these lives need to be remembered, and these failures need to be exposed again and again until the system finally learns. Until justice becomes the rule, not the exception. Until then, we keep searching, we keep asking, We keep demanding answers for Sarah and for all those still waiting to be found.